Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. I'm sitting with Australian-Latvian journalist Peter Greste. He is a former ABC, Al Jazeera journalist.
Former Al Jazeera journalist, former BBC, in fact, I also did a bit of work for CNN as well years ago.
Oh, I remember this. Yes, yes.
And former Reuters, and now an academic. So.
But he's also you're outspoken about press freedom and where journalism is headed today. Peter also spent time in prison in Egypt. I guess, tell me, we journalists have talked about, I talk all the time about drawing the line. What are the lines that you've drawn for yourself?
Look, the thing is that I really struggled with this when I was in prison. We were arrested and spent 400 days on terrorism charges. And we really struggled to work out, well, the best strategy to get out of it. And in the end, we decided to go for what I think a lot of people might consider to be a high-risk strategy, but we decided to fight it on the principle of an attack on journalism, because that's what we felt ultimately this was about. It wasn't about us specifically, because the gap between what we were accused of doing, acts of terror, was so far removed from what we were actually doing, which was frankly pretty mundane journalism.
I'd use the word ludicrous,
and it was a ludicrous gap. It was ridiculous. But the gap was so wide that I couldn't reconcile it. And the only thing I could think of, the only reason we realized we were being arrested was because this was an attempt to intimidate all journalists. And as such, we then became symbols of an attack on press freedom. So we had a responsibility to fight it, not just for ourselves, not just to get out of prison ourselves, but because of what that would have meant for everybody else that was behind us, all of the other journalists. So we had a much higher cause to fight, and on that basis we had to draw a line. I had to draw a line. So there were times in prison when the prospect of being taken out of Egypt came up, and I struggled with this for a while, but I said to my family that I'm not prepared to go at any cost. If it means that I have to acknowledge in any way that we might be guilty of some of the things that we're accused of, I was not prepared to walk away.
Yeah.
I wouldn't make any kind of deal or do anything that suggested that. And so that for me is where the line came. I will not back away from defending freedom of the press.
How did your time in prison change you?
It made me a bit of an evangelist, really. I mean, I've gone from being a Commonwealth Garden correspondent, reporter, no different to hundreds, thousands of others around the world, who work with professionalism and integrity, but that's what we do, we're storytellers, into someone who has now become something of an evangelist for press freedom. And it's not a thing that I've necessarily chosen, but it's something that, because of the circumstances, because of what happened to us in Egypt, because now I've got a story that's directly connected with that, I feel like that's now my mission. And so in that respect it's changed me. It's also made me, I think, a lot stronger in a lot of ways. I think most people are far stronger than they ever give themselves credit for. It's just that most of us are never really pushed to find out just where those limits are. I think if people were pushed, they'd discover that their limits are much further than they ever imagined.
Right.
In a way, I feel lucky enough to have actually been pushed and discovered that I am a lot stronger than I thought I was.
When you drew that line, you weren't willing to compromise on certain things. I mean, I'm sure your family didn't like
No,
that
they
idea.
didn't. No, they didn't like.
Where
that.
did you get courage to do that from?
I'm not sure whether it's courage or choice. In a way, I didn't feel like I had a choice, and I don't know quite where that is. And this is something that people who have been through or been forced to step up often say. I don't feel as though there is a choice. Courage comes from having to make a choice between putting yourself in the firing line or walking away and saving yourself. We were already in the firing line. We found ourselves in prison and we had to figure out how to respond to that. And to my mind, the only choice was to fight it on principle. And so in a way, it didn't feel as though there was any courage involved. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, I think that does make sense. I mean, so this was in 2013.
No,
right?
2014.
2014.
We were arrested at the end of 2013.
The end of 20, and then so 2014. How has your life changed since then?
I've become notorious, and again, not necessarily because of things that we did, but because of what was done to us.
Yeah.
And that's also why it felt a little bit awkward for a while. I didn't carry this easily. But I've also since understood.
You were a symbol. I mean, the first time we met was at World Press Freedom Day in Latvia.
Yes, yes, in Riga.
Things. And you were really, you had just gotten out of prison at that
yes.
point, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, you know, you find yourself in this position of notoriety, and people wanting to hear about what you went through and apply meaning to it. And in a way, what I've been doing since I got out of Egypt has been retrospectively validating what we went through. You know, if I did nothing with it, if I simply went back to my old day job, then that would have been 400 days of my life wasted, gone, kaput. You never get that back. Now though, by talking about it, by referencing it, by using that as an experience to talk to help others understand, it applies meaning retrospectively, and in a way it's also a way of metaphorically flipping a middle finger at our jailers to say, no, look, screw you. You tried to deprive us, you tried of a voice, you tried to silence us. What you've done, in fact, is given us a platform. You've given us microphones, and damn it, I'm going to use them.
Fantastic. This is a very different world. A lot has changed in the time we started as journalists to today. I mean, how would you describe what's happening to journalism today?
It's going through, we're in a transition phase, right in the midst of a revolution. And I don't think any of us really know how it's going to shake down. It can't possibly continue as it is. The business models are collapsing. Journalists are being laid off. News organisations don't have the resources to finance good professional journalism. They can't afford to keep experienced journalists going. They're asking journalists to do far too much, to work far too hard for far too little, and fragment the work that they should be doing. We haven't got the time or the resources to properly investigate, the time or the resources to cross-check and do stories properly. The only news organisations that are able to do that are those that have money from somewhere else that is not related to the journalism, and that's not viable. That's simply not a way of operating. So we need to try and figure out where we're going, and so I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, I'm confident that in the long term we'll figure it out. It's just that we've got to go through this really painful transitionary phase. What's not happening, and this is, I think, really important, Maria, what's not happening is that we're not having a discussion about the role that journalism should be playing in a functioning democracy. Because once we understand that, once we articulate that, once people understand that you can't have a properly functioning democracy, you can't have a strong democracy without strong journalism, if we agree on that, then we can start talking about how we engineer the system to actually get us to that point. At the moment, we're desperately trying to figure out how to patch up journalism to work in the current digital environment, and hoping and praying that something will emerge from the other side that will be effective. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think we need to have the end result in mind and try and engineer our way into that.
One of the big changes, of course, is the role technology platforms are playing in all of this. And you've done a documentary on Facebook in particular, but technology platforms have taken over the role of journalists as gatekeepers, right? I mean, how does this change everything? What do you see happening with this thing?
Look, we forget, and it's slowly starting well, Facebook is slowly starting to recognise it. They're being forced to recognise it. There was a lot of talk about this at Davos. They originally presented themselves as neutral platforms, as stages upon which life plays out. But they're not neutral. Our lives, our communication is governed by the algorithms, and the algorithms are designed to do one thing. That is make money for those companies. They're designed to keep our eyeballs, and so they give us the things that they know we want to see. That's not the things that we need to see, but the things that the algorithms detect we want to see.
Right.
And so our world is becoming narrower and more distorted because of the platforms. That's never going to work as a viable communication system. A year ago, Mark Zuckerberg wrote a famous manifesto, setting out the kind of role that he sees Facebook as playing. And it was both inspiring but also quite scary in its scale, because it put Facebook at the very center of all of our political, not just political communications, but the way, but elections. The whole election process could be done and carried out on Facebook. It puts it in the middle of economics, of commerce, of politics, of our social lives. And in a way, it struck me that he's elevated Facebook far beyond the role of a mere platform run by a private company into the role of a public utility. And when you start to think of Facebook as a public utility, then it gets quite scary to think that the whole thing is run by a company that is incredibly secretive about the tools that it uses to drive that system. And all of our data, all of our information is kept in secure servers offshore somewhere else that we have no control over and no access to. If Facebook is going to take that role, in fact the role that it's already playing is so ubiquitous that we need to be saying, no, it's too central to our lives to be controlled privately offshore. We need to start thinking of it as a public utility. That has all sorts of implications for the way it's regulated. Generally against regulation of speech, but at the same time I think we need to recognize that it's too central and too dangerous and counterproductive to be run as a for-profit business in the way that it is at the moment.
It seems that based on freedomhouse.org's report last November that authoritarian rulers have a better sense of how to use the platform. They said out of 65 countries they studied, social media armies controlled narratives and ruled democracy back in the 30s.
And that's because they're gaming the algorithms. Understand how the algorithms work, and because they're dealing often with fake news or with propaganda, they're able to cherry pick the kinds of triggers that grab our attention as audiences, that confirm our biases, that are sexy to us as viewers, as audiences, as readers of this stuff, as consumers of social media, as players on social media. And so they're very powerful in that regard, and the capacity to play the system, to game not just social media, but to game us as consumers. News, by definition, is much more restrictive because we deal with what's real. Now, we've got a responsibility to make these stories as accessible as possible, but we still have ethical, professional constraints that mean that we can't always be as sexy as that stuff. And so the playing field is not level. And that's where I think it's much easier for those trolls, the propagandists to tip the scales in favour of the demagogues of the world.
What can normal people do? Can they do?
Look, let's go back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. People need to recognise and understand the importance not just of supporting a free press, but consuming the stuff as well. People have and I think we're seeing a shift back to some of legacy media, the traditional media companies, because people are starting to recognise that, look, you can't survive or you can't be healthy living on McDonald's the whole time. You've got to eat your greens. You've got to have spinach in your diet. You might not always enjoy it, but you've got to have a balanced diet. It's the same with our news. We've got to be prepared to have a balanced diet. We've got to make a conscious effort to seek out genuine news services, credible news and authoritative news services. We've got to also, as members of the public, expose ourselves, be open to stories that give us ideas that we don't necessarily agree with. That's really important. But I also think, again, that if we've engineered ourselves into this crisis, there are also engineering solutions to get us out of it. And I think that there is, again, I know it's been talked about a lot, but then there has to be ways. I'm not an engineer. I don't have immediate solutions for this, but we've got to put a lot more pressure on the engineers to come up with solutions that bring us back some of the revenue that's been lost to Facebook, bring it back to journalism, ways of acknowledging good journalism. I mean, the blue tick on Twitter is a really valuable thing. People recognise it. It has weight. It is in a way has a degree of arbitrariness about it, but it means something. Yeah. And if we can have a way of verifying credible news in a similar way, then I think we'd be moving a step in the right direction.
So technology broke the power structures. Now they can also help.
They can help rebuild it.
Rebuild it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you've been in the Philippines for a few days. You were part of the Disinformation and Democracy Forum. Thank you for coming here for this. Your impression about the Philippines and where we are today?
You know, 4 days isn't enough anywhere near enough to get a real sense of Philippines and the Filipino media. But there are a couple of things that came out of the conference which are a little bit troubling. You know, the statistics about the numbers of fake news sites around the world is just over half of what the number of fake news sites in the Philippines alone. Now, I suspect there are quite a few sites that are probably missed, and the figures might not be quite so dramatic if there was a really good search, a proper, thorough search. But nonetheless, that vastly outscale size of the Filipino fake news sites is worrying. The Philippines somehow seems to have turbocharged fake news and trolls and so on, and I think that's a really worrying sign. I don't understand it. I'd be really interested. I think there's a whole world of study as to why it's happened, but it's clearly distorting public discourse. It makes people more divided, not less. It drives people apart. It's got to be a destructive thing. And I think that's a real problem.
In terms of making Facebook or pushing Facebook to take action in something like the Philippines, it actually declares in some of its filings that it knows that there's higher than number average of fake news sites, fake news Facebook accounts in the Philippines, right? They pointed that out. But what do you think it'll take to have, an American company more concerned about the West?
But this comes back to it, again, Facebook is, in California, it's governed by rules and laws and that are not part of the Philippines. Its servers are offshore. There's no access to it. But I think again, it's a company that is still sensitive to public pressure. It is still sensitive to the needs and demands of its users. And without wanting to keep coming back to our own story, one of the salutary lessons is that social media campaigns work. Public campaigns work. If enough people say to Facebook, this has got to change, then it will change. They're human beings after all, and they recognize it. And I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want to be seen as a pariah. His primary responsibility is, of course, to his shareholders, and of course that means to himself to a pretty significant extent.
Right.
But at the same time, they're not insensitive to that public pressure, and I think we need to raise our voices about this.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. Thanks so much for coming to the Rappler office.
It's been a great pleasure, Maria.
We've been speaking with Peter Greste, former Al Jazeera correspondent. He was jailed in Egypt for 400 days. Jailed in 2013.
2014.
2014.
I was jailed through
Arrested
2014.
Through trial. Okay. He's been great to tell us kind of what we can look forward to, what the role of journalism is. He's on Twitter @Peter Greste. Send him thoughts and comments. I'm Maria Ressa. Thanks for joining us.